I want to welcome everyone today to join us for this excellent event, which I think is going to be exciting and a unique set of voices here. Let me just start by saying we're very thrilled to have with us two highly esteemed energy experts who are EPIC's inaugural visiting fellows in policy practice. We have Sue Tierney, who is the Assistant Secretary for Policy at DOE for President Clinton. And Sue is now a senior advisor at the Analysis Group, but she has a long and star-studded career in energy land. And next to her, we have Jeff Homestead. Jeff was an associate counsel in the George H.W. Bush White House and was then assistant administrator of the U.S. EPA for air and radiation under George W. Bush. And he's now a partner at Bracewell, where he heads the firm's environmental strategies group. They're joined by Jeff Fahey, who is a famous and important energy writer, who is now the AP's global health and science writer. So welcome to Sue, Jeff, and John, and thanks for making the trip out to Chicago, and very excited for this conversation. And let me tell you a little bit more about this conversation. So this is new this year for us, that we want to have energy inquiry and impact series, and Jeff and Sue are going to join us all year long to participate in that series and lead us in that series. And today we'll have a slight twist, but in general what we're going to do in our effort to show that academics can be relevant in the real world, or at least with Jeff and Sue's help they can be relevant in the real world, we're going to try to each time feature a new paper written by someone on the faculty here. And then Jeff and Sue are going to help us understand how to think about that paper in the context of current policy debates and through the lens of the real world. And of course, if John wants to come back and join us in those conversations, he's always welcome. Okay, so for today's event, we're going to the forcing will not be the release of a new paper, but rather some findings that came from a poll that we conducted with the AP-NORC Center for Public Affairs Research. Then that poll's results were released on Monday. I think the results, there's some cool infographics and other ways to summarize it on the table outside. Hopefully all of you have had a chance to see that, and if not, you can get it on the way out. But it shed light on a series of important questions, including how much people are willing to pay to combat climate change, and I think the answers are very enlightening. It turns out that there's lots of people there's a fair number of people who are willing to pay a lot, and also a lot of people are not willing to pay very much. And so how one, and hopefully this will be a discussion today, can navigate the politics of that the average household is actually willing to pay quite a bit, but that average is derived from a lot of people willing to pay a lot, and a lot of people are willing to not pay very much. And I think still in democracy, it's still one person, one vote. It's not how much you're willing to pay. A second area that I think was especially enlightening was the degree to which arguments for or against fracking impact the support that people express for fracking. Additionally, how they feel about the repeal of the Clean Power Plan and the U.S.'s apparent withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. So as I said, all the results are displayed out there. So one thing that I just wanted to highlight, and again, we'll be looking for our three excellent participants to help us understand this and engage in it, that comes across with the poll questions is this polarization in America. And so you see Democrats and Republicans have extraordinarily, in some cases, extraordinarily different views on the very same question, some of which I think might even be factual questions. And what certainly I look forward to learning about is how to develop, how the political system can navigate those competing viewpoints, and the degree to which we can find common ground and even common understanding of some of the issues, even if that leads to different conclusions on what should be done. So without further ado, I'm very excited to hear this conversation, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to listen to us talk shop.
We hope as you listen to us and listen to the experts here, please think of questions. I look forward to the question and answer period later on in the program. So as I was thinking about how to frame this with these two experts here, I was thinking it would be awfully nice if what science says what we need to do about climate change, and what policymakers say we need to do about climate change, and what economists say we need to do about climate change, all matched up. Then we'd be working together to deal with the problem. In fact, it's all over the place. So what I want to do is sort of probe where there is some, where things do align, and maybe we can make some progress, and where they don't align, and how we can try to figure out how to get there. So I'm going to first start by asking Jeff a little bit about what's going on the ground in Washington in terms of energy policy. So we can sort of, we have some, our poll has given us some numbers showing what people think. I'm going to first ask Jeff what's going on in Washington on the policy side, and ask him to talk about a couple major points: the Clean Power Plan, electric power, transportation, and cafe, and then and Paris. So Jeff, where are we? What's going on? What's going on there?
Oh, by the time I finish, it'll be absolutely clear to everyone what's going on. So I need to be careful to say I am a Republican. I've been in the last 2 Republican administrations, but I don't speak on behalf of the Trump administration. However, I do follow pretty closely what's going on, and I think as well as anyone, I understand kind of what the thinking is. I want to start with the general point first. So every president, including Republican and Democratic presidents, has come into office talking about the desire to do regulatory reform. And whether that was Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, they had kind of the same executive orders, they had the same principles. Republicans tend to put more emphasis on it than Democrats. But the thing that is unique about the Trump administration is not that they talked about it, because George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, they had task force on regulatory reform, they had executive orders and other things. The big difference in this administration, especially when it comes to energy and environmental policy, is they've appointed people at the tops of agencies and departments who truly believe that their first priority is to reduce the burden of what they view as unnecessary regulation. So you look at, and again, I'm not going to go through all the history. Probably I'm the only one here who could name the administrators of EPA for the last 40 years. But, but under George H.W. Bush, you had Bill Riley, who came out of the environmental community, who was very interested in leaving an environmental legacy, which he did. In the George W. Bush administration, where I served in EPA, I had the opportunity to serve with Governor Whitman from New Jersey, who I enjoyed very much, but she was not, her priority was not regulatory reform, and she was very sensitive to criticism from the environmental community. The head of the EPA now is not, and he seems to be much more focused on sort of regulatory reform. So I think that's an important observation. In many ways, this is a very different administration. I think no one would disagree with that, but in this particular suite of issues, it's kind of remarkably different from anything we've seen in my professional lifetime. We could agree on that, probably. For those of us who do believe in regulatory reform, the bad news is they've had a very hard time getting going. And so on some of the things that we'll talk about, I hope the Clean Power Plan and the CAFE standards and a number of other things, there's a sense, I think, among people who don't live in our world that they've rolled back all these regulations. They've done an enormous number of things, and they really are just now kind of getting started. So I was looking the other day to see how many, because you hear, and I could probably list 15 things that they've said they're going to revisit, and they haven't really actually started the process yet, except with the Clean Water, with the WOTUS rule, where they've proposed to repeal the rule, but have not even really started to think about what they would put in its place. And we understand that probably this week there will be a proposal to repeal the Clean Power Plan, along with, it was reported today that they'll be putting out, okay, I won't use the acronyms, but they'll be putting out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, essentially to solicit ideas on what they might do to replace it, which is not a proposal, which means that they're still at the very early stages.
Let me just interrupt here. I know this is a very sophisticated audience, but let me be the reporter, the news for general audience person here. So they can't. It's a law. It's a regulation. It can't just be repealed with nothing to replace it because it is. It has been found that CO2 is a pollutant and must be regulated by the EPA.
Well,
correct? Is that what's going on?
That's a part of it, but more fundamentally, once a rule is established through the proper procedures, the only way you can undo that rule is to go through a similar rulemaking process. So in a nutshell, you have to develop a pretty detailed proposal. You have to put that out. You have to allow for public comment and public hearings. You then are legally required to respond to those comments when you explain the reason for your final rule.
Even in this case where the Clean Power Plan is not implemented and is in legal...
Because it was finalized and is a rule that, even though the Supreme Court stayed the rule and it's never come into effect, it still is a rule that went through those procedures, and that's the process that they will have to follow. One of the reasons it's taken a long time is they've taken a very long time to put appointees in place. And ordinarily you have assistant secretaries, assistant administrators who do most of the heavy work when it comes to implementing regulatory policy, and they're way behind any administration that we've had in my lifetime in terms of nominating people and getting them in place. So let me just quickly touch, I mentioned the Clean Power Plan. Sue and I have talked about this in public before. I believe...
And we're still sitting next to each other.
That's right.
Still managed to get back in the same one.
You know, it's extraordinary, it's very cleverly designed to do something.
That was not what he always said.
No, I always said it was very cleverly designed. I just think it's completely inconsistent with the statute, and I happen to know that's what this administration believes, and so I think they're going to propose this week to repeal it, essentially on legal grounds, and but they're going to indicate a desire to replace it with something else. So that process is only just now beginning, and if people are interested, we can talk in much greater detail about the Clean Power Plan. The other thing other particular policy you asked me to talk about, and I won't talk too much longer,
you're doing great.
Well, thank you. Is the CAFE standards, and people refer to them as the CAFE standard. It's actually an EPA rule that regulates CO2 emissions from cars. The Department of Transportation actually sets corporate average fuel economy standards, but they're essentially the same thing. And in fact, the way for years you calculated whether someone was in compliance with CAFE was you actually measured the CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
That's how you did it. I will tell you the interesting thing, without going through the whole history, there was essentially a three-way negotiation between the Obama administration, California, and the automakers to put in place these fuel economy standards that would go from 2011 all the way out through 2025. As is often the case with environmental regulation, the initial few years were relatively modest in terms of the increases, but towards the end, they get much more significant. And so part of this negotiation is they would have a midterm evaluation to determine whether the standards from 2022 to 2025 were still feasible. The Obama administration, on its way out the door, determined that yes, they were. If anything, they look even better now than they did back in 2012. And the Bush administration the Trump administration immediately came in and said that they were going to revisit those. Something that is unusual in my experience is on both the CAFE standards and the Clean Power Plan, in some ways you have industry who is moderating the instincts of the administration.
Yeah.
I think there were people in the administration who thought, let's get rid of the Clean Power Plan and be done with it. We're not going to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act. And you have a lot of people in industry who I think have persuaded the administration that for a number of reasons, both legal and policy and practical, it's better to have a replacement rule. It's played out even more publicly in the CAFE standards, because the administration basically came in and said, we're gonna completely get rid of those regulations. They were, it was too big of a burden, and we're going to undo them, and we're going to take on California because of this and over the next few days, you had the industry coming in and saying, hold on, that's not what we asked for. We'd really like to figure out if there's a way we can work with California and with the administration to come up with a little more flexibility that we can live with. And so you're seeing that play out not only in the Clean Power Plan, but also in the CAFE standards. And as I say, we're kind of at the beginning of both those processes. So I'll just say, you asked me to say a quick word about Paris.
Yeah, how do those two fit in with Paris?
They don't really fit in with Paris. I mean, they're all about regulating greenhouse gas emissions. I think the attention on Paris and the withdrawal from Paris was kind of overblown. I don't think ultimately whether the US stayed in or dropped out of Paris made that big of a difference for reasons we can talk about.
That big of a difference for global emissions?
Yes.
Or for...
Yeah, no, for global emissions. Okay. And even for US emissions, quite honestly. And one of the reasons I say that is the US has continued to be part of all the international discussions about measuring and verification and monitoring techniques, and that all happens at a staff level. The United States is still in Paris and will be for another 2.5 years. But the other thing about it is, I think it was politically important for the president to do that. There were people who he promised he was going to do that, but ultimately, when there's a change in administrations, whether that's in 4 years or 8 years, the new administration, especially if it's a Democratic administration, will simply sign back up again. And I don't think the rest of the world is fundamentally changing anything about the way it's conducting its business because of... So anyway, but I think that that debate played out in public. There were different cabinet secretaries on different sides of the issue. It was a very unusual thing, but I think if you really care about global climate change, there's a lot of other things that we should be talking about.
So let me ask you, so the revisiting the Clean Power Plan, we'll see revisiting CAFE or not, does directly affect the nation's emissions, and whether it's under Paris or not, our emissions, right? So where are we on that? Like, what's going to happen then? Business as usual, how far does that get us?
So happily, business as usual gets us part of the way toward the Paris goals. So the Paris goals are to have the US voluntarily commit to reducing 26 to 28% of greenhouse gas emissions relative to 2005. And two big planks of that were the Clean Power Plan and the Fuel Economy Standard. So if in fact they're being disrupted, then a lot of questions about what fills the gap. And as you know, as many of you know very well, the fact that natural gas is beating coal in terms of generating electricity on economic grounds, that has reduced emissions a lot. And flat electricity demand has also kept things under control. And then on the margin, we see increase of solar and wind just coming on and on and on, in part driven by a fabric of state policies that are very enthusiastic about renewables, even in red states. Windy red states are very favorable to wind. So there's, the studies that I have seen says that we could get, with that business as usual, that kind of combination, where a lot, and most of these assume that fuel economy standards will still be in place, right, that you could get to about 20%. So there still is a gap there, but the things that are driving momentum that I think will make it so that it's going to be an interesting couple of years is you see hundreds of corporations signing up for long-term agreements for renewable energy. They want a zero carbon footprint for their electricity supply, and they're willing to pay a premium in order to have known prices for electricity when you sign up for that supply at the beginning. So hundreds of companies are doing that. We see the electric industry switching, not only because of gas and the economics of it, but I think that they see that there's actually an opportunity, electric companies, of selling more electricity if you nibble at the passenger vehicle market with electric and hybrid markets. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for electricity companies moving in this shift. And states and cities are really out there pushing this. I mean, right after the Paris Agreement, as you probably saw, there was the "We're Still In" campaign, right. Where people signed up and said that we are going to be shifting. Now, the thing that I do think I would disagree, maybe we agree on this, but it's just we haven't gotten enough of the conversation going on it yet. I think the biggest thing that that happened when the U.S. signaled that we were intending to withdraw with Paris is it just gave China a huge pat on the back. China is going to be driving a number of the markets, the technologies that we're talking about. It gave them a real boost internationally in terms of being a leader. So right now it is France, Germany, and China who are really going to be leading. And that is a huge opportunity lost by the United States to be in play and pushing technologies into other markets, and I think. So
let me ask you about that. I hear that, and I can understand it in the abstract, but what does that mean practically? I mean, do U.S. companies stop pushing? I wouldn't think so. It's a global market.
I'm glad he asked that question because I wonder the same thing. Really, what does it mean so U.S. technology experts are no longer going to be competing for?
So the U.S. Department of Energy, its Advanced Technology ARPA-E program, zeroed out in the Trump budget. The Grid Modernization program, zeroed out in the Trump budget.
Okay, so I agree. All those things are those are consequential.
Those are R&D.
But what does that have to do with whether the United States shows international leadership in Paris? That has to do with funding, right? I mean, I think.
I was going to your innovation question. And so that's what I was talking about is why. So U.S. support for, advanced nuclear, U.S. support for advanced coal with technologies to address it. China's going to be doing those kinds of things. And so I do think that signal coming out of Washington does put a damper on a lot of the support for early stage.
So it's a knock-on effect. We're not pursuing Paris. We don't really need these technologies. We're not going to fund them. Is that the practical implication?
There are a lot of technologies that will need to get off the drawing board to actually accomplish deep carbon reductions. And the U.S., in essence, abdicating a leadership role in an R&D platform, as a signal coming out of the Trump administration, I think is a problem. Congress, ironically, is more of a fan of some of these technologies, and I do think that they're likely to restore them in the budget. But I think that was a kind of a 1-2 punch of, we're not going to send the signals to the markets that this is where we want to go, and in fact, we're going to drag it down with R&D.
Let me take it back to the poll here for a little bit. Let's see, we have 72% say climate change is happening, 61% say the government should do something about it. Are regular people further ahead of lawmakers and regular people and companies further ahead than lawmakers and policymakers here? Is that true? And if so, why? And how does that change happen?
You want to start?
No, you go first.
So I think it goes back to the point that Michael said in the very beginning about polarization. I think regular people, I live in Colorado. It's a red and blue state. And regular people that, not just my buddies that I hang out with a lot who do believe that climate change is occurring, but even folks who you're hobnobbing with in a variety of places, they get it, that they think climate change is happening. Of course, there are important esoteric technical scientific studies about is man causing it or not. Those conversations with the public usually don't get to that point, but they're buying that climate change is happening. But it has become such a third rail issue about, are you for coal? And are you for Appalachia and making sure that we're making America great again? That was not nice of me to put it that way. And if you are for coal, you cannot buy into a climate agenda. I'm exaggerating to make the point. And the Democrats are equally shrill on the other side. So I think the polarization problem is how you get to action on this. And the Obama administration got to action by saying Congress is never going to get there. So that's why we had to shoehorn solutions. What was a creative shoehorn solutions into the existing statutory frameworks?
So it's a question of how congressional districts play out. Is that the answer?
Extremes, sure. I mean, in some sense, campaign finance,
right.
Gerrymandering, all of that stuff is a horrible. This is a horrible outcome of that, of those problems.
Jeff, what do you think about that? Is it why is it why? How do we get to a place where a Republican can be a full-blooded Republican and think that climate change is real and that something needs to be done about it?
See, those are two, to my mind, those are two very different questions. Mm-hmm. There's actually three questions. So climate change is real, that's one issue. Right. And I think the majority of the polls say that the majority of Republicans believe that that's the case. Mm-hmm. We should do something about it, and that number drops off a little bit. But then the hard thing is, well, okay, what is that thing
right.
that we're going to do about it?
Right.
So, you know, it's one thing to say we all believe that the climate is changing, that human beings are causing all of it or some of it, and then you get to the hard questions about what do you do about it. And I think if it were easy and inexpensive to deal with climate change, Republicans would believe in the science. I mean, that was probably not quite the way I intended it to come out. But
just move that tape back.
But the fact that you know, the people who say we need to do something about climate change seem to be against heavy industry and against mining, and so the fact that all these people are attacking things that you care about as the solution to deal with climate change makes you less inclined to believe that climate change is a real problem.
But market-based approaches to it got awfully close in Congress a couple times. I think once under Bush, once under Obama, awfully close to, you know, cap and trades or, you know, market. Wasn't it a Republican proposal that came up under Obama?
No.
The cap and trade?
No.
No.
Not at all. So here's in 1 minute a history of cap and trade.
Yeah.
It was invented by economists back, and Michael could probably tell us the exact year and the exact paper, but that idea has been around for a while, but it was never politically acceptable until the first Bush administration. Right. Okay. Adopted it in the Clean Air Act of 1990 as a way to deal with acid rain. And at the time, the environmental community was against it, right. Most Democrats were against it, and it was really largely because of the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, where they had some very fine economists who got it enough support among the Democratic side to get this cap and trade program in place. And it turned out to be enormously successful. Not only did it get the reductions faster,
and cheaper.
And much cheaper, but it just kind of freed up companies to figure out a number of things that no one had really thought about before as a way to reduce their emissions.
So why didn't it work on climate? And can it? So is that what's going to happen?
I think ultimately that may happen. I actually think that not in the next 2 years, or probably not the next 4 years, but I do think we will have some sort of climate change legislation. For a couple of reasons. One, I think that the business community would like to have some long-term certainty for their investments. Now, they're willing to pay something for that certainty. They're not willing to pay any price, but they're willing to do something for that kind of regulatory certainty. And I think society is moving in the direction of saying, we need to do something about climate change. And I think that ultimately you will see something like that come together. But here is an insight I think I almost uniquely have maybe in this room about what that's going to take.
Let's watch.
So I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
So people like Sue say to me that President Obama took a leadership role. He wanted, the cap and trade to pass. But they never did the kind of hard work that is necessary to get that kind of legislation through. And the reason I say I have a unique perspective is, when I was a young man, I was in the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and amazingly, in retrospect, in 1988, he campaigned, he wanted to be the environmental president. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he called for in his campaign was to modernize the Clean Air Act. And not only did he call for that, but he actually and his team of people put together a very detailed legislative proposal. They put something on the table, and then they spent the next year and a half actually working with Democrats on the Hill, with environmental groups, with industry groups, hammering together all of the compromises. And what that took was a White House that was fully invested in the issue. And literally, now that I've lived in Washington for another 25 years, I realize how unusual that was. Mm-hmm. But there were literally 5 of the president's closest advisors who every day worked on climate change legislation.
Well, you'll get people in the environmental community to back you up. They were very disappointed that more wasn't, the administration didn't push as hard.
And recall that what they were doing is having to decide whether to do Obamacare. Right. Or this, and right. Which one to ride first.
Right. Yeah. Let me talk to you about the certainty thing.
But again, I think that's the only way it happens. I think it takes a White House who is really willing to roll up its sleeves and to put a proposal on the table and take the slings and the arrows and then start negotiating. And the other thing that happened there is when its own constituency, when the White House felt like the power sector was being unreasonable about acid rain, they pushed back. To their own constituency. They said, look, here's these studies, here's the way it will work, we think it's going to be much less expensive than you do. And we never saw the Obama administration really push back on its own constituency to try to get some things that would have enabled Waxman-Markey could have passed if there was a safety valve. Mm-hmm. I think we might have legislation today, but that was unacceptable to a certain constituency, and the Obama administration never pushed back on that.
I'll have to say, as a paid skeptic, I find it shocking to think that we're anywhere close to on any path to an economy-wide carbon limiting mechanism. I mean, it seems like we're going in the opposite direction fast. It's like, how can, I don't even understand how you can say it. Like, where is the evidence that we're going to head that way? I mean, we couldn't get there.
So it's all around us. I mean, everywhere I go, people talk about this. People in Washington talk about it. Business groups talk about it. And political moments happen and they change, and you have to be prepared for when that moment happens. So I'm not going to tell you it's going to happen in the next 2 years or the next 4 years, but I am pretty confident that will happen. Now, I don't think that's going to solve the climate issue, because I think the only way to solve the climate issue is to invest in technologies that will actually make it, cost competitive around the world to have, electric power and transportation at a cost that's competitive with coal and oil, and we're a long way from that today.
I want to get back to technology in a little bit, but let me let me push you on the certainty. It's another thing you hear. Businesses, they don't care what the policy is nearly as much as they care. They want the certainty. They want to be able to plan. Just tell me what the rule is, and I'll figure it out and get there. Just give me some certainty. First of all, it doesn't happen. You're not going to get certainty.
And it didn't happen on discussions about Clean Power Plant either.
Second of all, as soon as the policy is put forth, it's fought. Like, you could get certainty right now by saying, okay, we have the Clean Power Plant. It's not perfect, but it's certain. Let's just keep it. But there's a disconnect.
There was nothing that was ever certain about the Clean Power Plant. It was there was so many legal issues, and especially with a regulation. Even if you have 90% of the industry, 99% If you have one person that's going to challenge that, I mean, courts really do kind of work this way. They look at the law, they look at the, and people knew, anybody involved in that knew there was a pretty good chance it was going to be vulnerable, either because it would be struck down in court, or it would be struck down, or it would be overturned by the next administration. And I'll give you an example of that. Recently, what was the name of that protocol where they agreed to phase out the
Montreal protocol?
Montreal.
No, not Montreal, but more recently.
The Kigali one.
Kigali.
Yeah.
Where virtually all of U.S. industry supported a phase out of HFCs.
Yeah.
And that, there was essentially unanimity on that issue internationally and in the U.S., but somebody challenged that. And the D.C. Circuit read the Clean Air Act and they said, you don't have authority to do that under Title VI of the Clean Air Act. This is designed to let you deal with ozone-depleting substances, not to deal with substances that have no impact on the ozone layer, but you want to get rid of them because they're climate change. And they said, this may be a good policy, but it's not what you can do under the Clean Air Act. So you really do, even legislation doesn't give you absolute certainty, but it gives you certainty, a much higher degree of certainty than you could ever get through regulation. And
Jeff will probably be surprised to hear me say that there wasn't even certainty on the markets side, I'll say. I'm not a lawyer, so I'll talk about the way it was going to be playing out in the states. There just was so much uncertainty about which way or another a particular state was going to be
Because
going.
it was up to the states to establish
exactly.
how to do it, right?
Yeah.
Right. We're talking about it as if it's gone.
Yeah.
I guess it's going to be gone this week.
It's not going to be gone this week. There will be a proposal to repeal the Clean Power Plan. And then that proposal could be finalized within 6 or 8 months. But my guess is that they won't actually finalize the repeal until they have a replacement ready to go at the same time. So I would guess they propose the repeal, some months later they propose a replacement rule, and then they finalize them both together.
And then that gets taken to court.
And then that gets taken to court, yeah.
And so we have uncertainty for a long time.
We have uncertainty for a long time.
Right.
But let me just say, it is a great time to be a Clean Air Act lawyer.
I bet. So back to the poll again, and this sort of dovetails with the question I had, or the comment that I had that seems like we're very far away from any sort of consensus. There were no clear majorities in the poll on a bunch of crucial questions. Whether to abandon Paris, fracking, pipelines, energy policy direction in general, and monthly fees. So I'm talking about over 50%, right?
Can I just tell you the most curious thing about the poll?
Sure.
Is that you had a number of people who were willing to pay $100 a month, but not
we're
willing to pay $75 a month. And even more who were willing to pay $40, but not $20.
But not 20, I know, it's bizarre. So I want to talk about costs, as Michael does. Do we care? This suggests we don't care. And also the polls show that terrorism, the economy, and at least healthcare, we're all much more important to people. So there's no clear majorities on a whole bunch of these issues, and people care about other things. Is it a lack of, is it that we just don't care as a society enough to push our representatives to vote a certain way? Are policymakers or lawmakers reacting, in fact, in a completely rational way by not doing anything?
If we're talking about the public.
Yes. They are acting in a completely rational way.
Oh, yeah.
As a politician, certainly they are.
So, think about yourself and what gets you agitated enough politically to act on something. And, it's no rocket science to have guessed that the poll would say they care more about health care, they care more about opioids, or whatever the real things that today are affecting somebody's life and out-of-pocket costs. Now, people in Puerto Rico right now might be willing to connect the dots between the horror shows of extreme weather events, the fact that their entire system is just going to be disrupted for maybe for the rest of some of those people's lives. So the reason I mention Puerto Rico is that until something is frontally in your face, climate change feels like it's, oh, that's my grandchildren's problem. Well, I mean, that's a problem, to the nature of the beast in that way. But I think more and more we will see these horrible events where people may begin to connect the dots. And we talked a little bit a minute ago about people don't want to spend money to address climate change, but they are spending money in terms of damages all the time, which is why I think cities are stepping up and saying, you know, we are facing real risk of sea level rise and turbulence along the waterfronts and everything else. So I'm kind of evading your question, and I'm not meaning to. I just think that until things are material, salient, actionable, and people know what to do, I think they believe it's happening.
Are you describing
but they're not
a failure,
acting politically.
Is this a failure of the media? Are we screwing up here? No.
I would not say that. Never. Media.
Look, this has gotten, over the 20 years I've been working on this, it's gotten an enormous amount of media attention.
Oh, yeah.
And it ebbs and flows, but it's got a lot of media attention.
Yeah.
The thing that strikes me about, and there was a couple of things about the poll, but one of them was 50% of the people said they weren't willing to spend even $1 a month
right, let's
to
talk
deal with
about
climate
that.
change.
Yeah.
And that's the largest percentage by far. The other thing that this poll didn't have, but that is done every year by Gallup, is they, rather than saying, you know, how much do you care about this, and you can say, you care very much, I care about all these issues, I care about the economy, and I care about and all these things, they ask people to rank 15 issues or 20 issues that are kind of public in the news.
Yeah.
And almost every year, climate change is at the bottom.
Right.
And so you do have this smaller group of people who care passionately, but climate change, for the reasons, you know, it does seem like
it's diffuse. It's a diffuse problem.
And it's off in the future. And as hard as people try to connect the dots, and again, it is remarkable. This past summer, it's just unbelievable.
Fires, heat waves, droughts.
But so people will invest in seawalls because they can see an immediate connection between what they're going to invest in. But people are rational, and they say, so you want me to spend $20 a month more, or whatever the number would be, and what benefit do I get out of it? And the answer is, well, hopefully, if we do that, other countries will do that, and ultimately there'll be a difference in the climate 50 years in the future. It's very hard to get people. And so in some ways you're asking people to act, you know, very altruistically.
Right.
And say, I'm willing to spend, and I think people are willing to do that. By the way, I'm maybe the most optimistic one here about having legislation, because,
I know.
so you tell me back in 1988 how many people really cared very much about modernizing the Clean Air Act, right? I mean, but you had enough people who were in the right positions to say this is important. Ultimately, you have to sell it politically, and clean air is an easier sell than climate change.
But don't you think?
But I think it requires the same kind of effort that the George H.W. Bush administration, maybe not, but that was a remarkable moment, and we've never seen anything like that again. Well, we didn't see anything like that in the Obama administration.
And John, you asked about the role of the media, and I'm going to try to connect it back to what you're just saying. We are at a different time politically today than we were in the 80s. The center could function to find common ground. The media is which media?
Right.
You know, which echo chamber are you listening to? And which channels on the, did I get channels right on the web? I don't know if I'm saying that
portals.
right. Yeah, portals. And everybody's just reading the ones that they want to read. So that doesn't help with bridging the gaps. And I think Congress knows that. And I'm going to shoot myself. This is so depressing.
Well, right. I'm sorry to take us down this road. Yeah, no, obviously we in the media get very frustrated when people, the media fails or succeeds in this or that. It's like saying restaurants fail. And there are really good restaurants and there are really bad restaurants. You can't say restaurants are good and bad. And it's very hard for us to distinguish ourselves that way.
So it seems like we have hit a nerve here, John. Would you like to talk a little bit more about it?
I'm not the expert here. No, I will say, though, that in terms of reporting the connection to some of the weather, you know, we are very, very careful to talk to, you know, the best scientists, and a lot of them, and no one will connect a single storm to climate change because the data simply aren't there.
But the patterns are.
The patterns are there. But well, we have a story. I guess I'm going to talk about it. It's going to run tomorrow. We looked at.
Call them up.
We looked at. It can't be reproduced. So I think we're good, and it's going tomorrow. But there are. We looked at 30-year periods as of major hurricane activity, because that climate scientists use 30-year periods to look at big, and this 30-year period is by far the most active. But we don't have 30-year periods back too far to really know if it's a trend. So that we're back to where we are. Yes, every measure we have now certainly suggests that things are getting more intense now. But we don't have we don't know where the baseline is. So is it getting a lot more intense? Is it just a little more intense? We don't know. And that, in every story we do, we have to hammer that we can't tie it directly to climate change. And it makes for a very mushy story, but that's what we got to do.
Well, and I think the pro climate change action crowd sometimes overplays its hand. Right? I mean, you hear, and I agree that most journalists and most scientists are very cautious. But to hear certain politicians and advocates, you know, we just need the Clean Power Plan to solve this problem. And it turns out to be much more complicated.
I want to jump in because scientists are not cautious when they are talking about the body of evidence. If it's connected to one storm, they're
right.
Absolutely cautious.
And that's
but they are, the level of uncertainty about what is happening is so strong now.
Okay, so how do we prevent those? How do we prevent the next Hurricane Maria? Is it all just a matter of getting away from fossil fuels? And see, the problem is it's not. There's nothing there, and that makes this complicated, and I think we're going to talk about adaptation too. But whatever we do on the mitigation side,
we need to do a lot more.
We need to do a lot. We need to do a lot more on the adaptation side because.
And if you don't do everything as aggressively as you can in a smart way soon, then the adaptation is going to be suffering. A lot of suffering around.
Well, maybe so. Let's talk. Let's go back to the money issue for a little bit. A couple things I wanted to ask about that. One, in the poll, what you said, that so few people are willing to pay. Actually, like Michael said, surprisingly, a lot of people will pay $40 a month,
but not 20.
Right, but not 20. And then, and surprisingly, few people, only half, are willing to pay $1. Let me also tie into the price of energy, electricity, gasoline. Surprisingly has gone down, and or stayed flat, or it's been a huge surprise. And I think when policymakers were thinking about how to go ahead in 2005, they were thinking, wow, this is going to be a lot easier to push because people will be paying so much for power that it'll quickly pay, whatever investments they're making will pay back, and that's simply not the case. How does that change? If energy prices have gone down, electricity prices
in real terms
are down for over 30 years. Gasoline prices are quite low, as we all know.
And as a percentage of your household income.
Also down. And now people aren't going to pay an extra $1. I mean, that doesn't get them. They're still paying way less than they were. So how do we get? Is it a comparison with the cost of mitigation? What is it? How can we get across that in fact this might be a good investment? And how do we get people to think about it's $1 now on your electric bill, but is it still too diffuse? But it's a potential savings down the road. So how does let me? That's a terrible question. how does the change in electric prices, in energy prices in general, how does that decline change the way we should think about policies, whether it's cap and trade, a carbon tax? That the whole goal was to get that price that people see up to help them pay extra for conservation.
That's a impossible question. I'm sorry. There's a communications element of it about the variety of things that we're talking about in terms of what people would be getting for $1. There's probably a socioeconomic component of it. I don't know, Michael, whether or not and AP, whether or not the underlying data are stratified by income. Because that wouldn't surprise me. $1 on an electricity bill of a lot of people is a lot of money. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of folks in that category. People don't do a good job of thinking, okay, I'm going to pay $1 more out of this pocket, and I'm going to have to pay less out of something else, whether it's taxes for adaptation or anything else. This is totally wonky the way I'm describing it, but we don't do a good job of making those kinds of connections. So how do we act on it? Boy, if I were a communications genius, I would not be in the job.
Well, it sort of circles back to, we need policy. We need policy to do this for us, because it's to set up a market that will let this play out. But that will be even harder, I would think, with lower energy prices. In other words, when oil is 100 and I'm paying $3.50 a gallon, and then the price of carbon goes on top of that, now I'm paying $4.
Yeah, but you don't even talk about the price of carbon. It's amazing how well markets work, right? When oil was above 100 a barrel, hybrid vehicles were selling well. Smaller vehicles were selling pretty well.
Right.
So there's no doubt that the cost of energy plays a huge impact.
Well, and the shift from natural gas to coal is playing out as a result of market forces.
Right. It had nothing to do with this price on CO2.
Right.
It just happened that, yeah.
And has an impact.
So I guess, will a price on CO2 work? If it only adds if the price on CO2 took effectively the price of a barrel of oil from 100 to 125, does that matter more than 50 to 75? On percentage term, obviously it's much higher, but $75 oil, if you told me $75 oil in 2010, you'd be like, wow, that's cheap.
And it is.
Right?
Yeah.
So do we need a different mechanism?
But can I say, I think sometimes we're too enamored about the way to solve this problem is putting a price on carbon.
That's what I'm asking.
He said that in Chicago.
That's what I'm asking.
No, but so, great, let's have a price on carbon of $50 a ton in the United States. What would that do to solve global climate change?
It would begin to make a dent, but it is not enough.
It's not even close to enough. It does almost nothing if you look at the trajectory of what's going on in the rest of the world over time. And so what we would be saying is, well, if we did that, other countries would follow suit, and that would have an impact. But I think we don't pay enough attention to the idea that we really do need we need technology to solve this for us. If it's only a matter of saying, okay, everybody drives smaller cars and live in smaller houses and eat less meat, good luck with that.
Right.
I don't think you're going to solve. I don't think you're going to solve anything through that. But the way you could see it being solved is if there are new technologies that fundamentally change the way things work. And Sue has heard me say this before. But the reason that people around the world build coal-fired power plants isn't because they're climate criminals. It's not because they want to. It's because they're looking for the least expensive way to provide electricity to people who live without.
Totally agree with that. Totally agree with that.
And so, until somebody finds a way to provide the benefits that they get from that coal plant at a cost that's competitive, we're not going to solve the climate. It's fun to talk about a price on carbon. Anybody who's an economist will say that's the most cost-effective way of changing the curve. But unless we could do a worldwide cost on carbon, and they think the politics of doing it in the United States, but on the other hand, if we had mechanisms to incentivize breakthrough R&D, and if, you know, $40, $50 a ton is going to make people, you know, it's going to cause a shift at the margin between coal and natural gas and renewables, but it's not necessarily going to cause people to invest billions of dollars in basic R&D that could actually lead to breakthroughs. So I think it would be easier to get political consensus around more. And the Trump budget obviously didn't follow my advice on this. But Congress is not going to, they're not going to zero out RP.
I do know that.
And in fact, I think there would be a lot of people who would like to invest in, you know, in basic R&D that could actually lead to breakthroughs that could solve the climate problem.
So you were going to say?
Well, what I was going to say is on policy, I ascribe to the view that you really do want to add a price somehow on carbon, because it will shift signals, and markets are extremely powerful. I would not throw out
I don't disagree with that.
And I would not throw out every regulation, because the body of evidence is that there are lots of different barriers to entry and a variety of other things that prevent markets from functioning. And a lot of regulations address those, and therefore they can send a different signal to pull in technology. And then I do think we certainly need R&D. One of the problems in Congress on that whole package is, actually it's not Congress, it's in the constellation of interest groups who are talking about this. On the one hand, we have a number of Republicans who are very interested in advancing modular nuclear technology for a lot of national security reasons, economic, and carbon. That is anathema to the environmental groups who say we can do it 100% with renewables. Both of those, by the way, are, you know, we have so many technical issues on both sides of those to solve. But that polarization then makes it so hard for people to come into a middle and say, yeah, we actually do need technology to advance the turbines that are really high and can get great wind offshore. And we need to work on advanced nuclear or carbon capture, a variety of different things. But the constituencies for each one of those is so, you know,
right,
elbowing out everybody else.
Right, and the kind of log rolling that often works doesn't seem to work with those groups.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're seeing some of that. We talk about I was just complaining about it to people talking about the media as a monolithic thing. The energy industry is not monolithic at all, and we're seeing it with the natural gas. The natural gas people in the electric power industry are unhappy with the regulations that seem to be favoring coal and nuclear. I was asking Sue about.
And I'm wondering how that fits into the regulatory reform agenda. So the thing that we're talking about, you want to set it up, or should I set it up?
Go for it.
So we've all been looking for signs, in addition to repealing the Clean Power Plan or other things, that the administration is going to be doing something for coal. There was a big grid study, and it didn't really make the case for doing more for coal. And so last week, Secretary Perry at the Department of Energy asked the utility regulators at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to do something for coal and nuclear. But effectively, it's very much about coal. And it is a new regulation to basically pay folks to stay online. It is not a market-based approach. It's kind of it's a very distorting mechanism if it were to actually be adopted by FERC. But it also seems counter to the regulatory reform agenda.
And what are the prospects for it? Do we know?
I believe that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will want to do steps to show that they are trying to address a problem in the price formation in wholesale electricity markets. we can have a whole conversation about that. They're going to want to do that. There's not enough sensible language in what the secretary sent over that I don't know how they would implement that in a market-friendly approach. So I think we'll see movement, but I think they will lose incredible credibility if they actually adopt this.
When should we turn to questions? I can keep going for a while, but how are we for time? What's the appetite here?
We can take questions now from the audience.
Or maybe you have one more question.
All right, think about your questions. I'll keep going here. On the technology front, is it ARPA-E? Is it grants to academic labs? Is it the national labs? How do you fund it, and how much more needs to be spent in directed how? Like, if that's what we need, where are we going to get it, and where's it going to go?
So, I'm not trying to avoid the question. I don't have a specific proposal to make, but I will say that there has been some very interesting work done, and the NAS did a study a decade ago of basically mechanisms, policy measures that the government could take to effectively support basic R&D in different sectors, and they did say nice things about DARPA, and so there's been some really interesting academic work to say, okay, if the idea here, the government can waste money as well as anybody else, and you don't, you want to make sure that however, if you're spending public funds, that you have a strategy for how those should be allocated, how those should be spent. So I do believe that collectively we should be making more investment. Exactly how to structure that, I'm actually a big supporter of ARPA-E. I think it's done some pretty amazing things.
Agreed.
But I don't know that, yeah.
You do see some bipartisan support for investment in infrastructure, certainly, at least, I mean, the Trump budget tried to reduce the NIH funding, and Congress, in fact, raised it. Like, you see that. Are there prospects for bipartisan support for at least on that side, on the technology side, more investment?
I don't know that I would say more investment, but a continued level of investment, I would say. I mean, there is tremendous opportunity that could be accomplished by more investment, but I just think the budget constraints are so tight that we're not likely to see that.
Let me get, I'm sorry to get depressing again, but I was covering energy closely in the early 2000s, and when clean tech in Silicon Valley was what everybody wanted to do. Oil prices looked like they were going to never stop rising. Electricity prices were so high that merchant power companies were planning nuclear facilities. I mean, there was money, and there was money in solar thin films, and there was money in batteries, and there was money in every manner, and little nukes. Where is it? I mean, the solar panels that are dominant today are the exact same technology that's been around for, I don't know, half a century. The wind turbines are better, but they're wind turbines.
They're way better.
They're better.
I mean, again, I'm not an expert in solar, but it's way better on a cost per kilowatt hour basis. They're way better.
It's the same technology. It's not transformative, right? It's not transformative. It is, in part because of overcapacity, the price of solar panels went way down, but and strange incentives globally. I mean, that had as much to do with the price of solar panels going down as anything else. There's been no transform. Where's the great battery? People spend. It's not close. So, there's a thermodynamic problem here, and that people in this room probably know a lot better than me. There is a crap load of energy in a molecule of gasoline. We talked about it before. There's it's a fabulous molecule in every. I mean, it's compact. It has a lot of energy. It's easy to move around. There's a lot of it in the ground. I mean, nature did a terrific job with this, And except for one thing, and that is when you burn it, too many people burn it ruins our atmosphere. So that's
Damn that nature.
Right, but that's the part. So on the technology side, we have a really high hurdle. That gasoline molecule or a natural gas molecule, the hydrocarbons are great energy packets. So the only thing we have to deal with the downside. So we either have to deal with the downside, or the technology problem of overcoming this seems bigger than any investment that we can. How are we really going to beat nature at this?
So not given the economics today, but there's tremendous work going on in bioliquid fuels. And I'm not talking about ethanol. I'm talking about algae and other things that are designed to try to have a virtuous cycle about the carbon emissions, and also have it be portable so that you could use it in airplanes and other things. But that is still needs work on a lot of basic chemistry, and now I'm way over my skis in terms of knowing what it is that needs to be done. A lot of great work going on in that at NREL and a variety of other places. So there is a lot of potentially transformative work to be done. It's not going to happen tomorrow, and it still needs care and feeding in the vines at the universities and the labs.
Any questions to cheer us up, maybe? So I think there are microphones. Is that true?
And we're going to tell you whether you're cheering us up or not.
Well, I have to ask Mike. I have to call on Michael first.
Okay, thanks. So one thing I just want to come back to the questions on how much people were willing to pay, and I want to just narrow in on one part of that. Or maybe a couple points. First, one thing is this is like textbook policy and textbook economics. Like there is an externality from CO2, that is CO2 causes damages. So
social cost of carbon.
Yeah, so so full stop. That's just a fact, and no matter what people say about it, that's true. One. Two, it looks like on average the American people are willing to pay much more than it would pay enough to have a really substantial price on carbon. And so
more than Reggie's $10.
Yeah, more than Reggie's $10. So I guess I wanted to focus the question loosely framed is, if we take those as constraints, how does one design a policy that satisfies the average American household, not every American household, that to solve what is really like a textbook and simple problem to deal with?
You would ask a really hard question.
I'm assuming, I'm hoping that you asked the question because you have an answer, because you're the most likely person in the room to have an answer to that question.
Well, no, but I wanted to put that some constraints on the conversation. But you know, the obvious thing we do in politics is we pay people off. We transfer to some people. And given how much the average household is willing to pay, it seems like it shouldn't be that hard to arrange it. And in fact, I think in Wax and Markey there was a lot of effort to try and make exactly those things. Well,
and people have talked about the design of a carbon tax where the money would be recycled, of course, in a lump sum so that you didn't distort the mechanism. And you could get back on those. These are all theoretical discussions because we're, in light of what I said about Congress a few minutes ago, it's probably a big disconnect between what I'm saying. You could design it so that it satisfied that.
Why isn't Congress responding to that? Because if that's the will of the American people, why aren't they designing? It's not hard to design a policy to satisfy that, with transfers and lump sum payments and things like that.
You would have to admit that carbon was a problem in order to do that. And I don't think that we have leadership in either house that is willing to do that.
And the will of the people, that might sounds a little strong. The question was, would you be willing to? Not, you know, this is not people clamoring to pay extra money. I think that would be, I mean, I'm not supposed to, I'm not.
You get to have an opinion.
That would be a different thing, right? If people wanted to do something versus, yeah, sure, I'll pay a little bit.
But the other question I have for you, whatever the average, what you calculated was roughly on average maybe $30 a person or $30 a household?
Household, I forget the average. I think actually only close to 50 or 50 bucks a household.
So have you run the numbers to see what that would mean in terms of actually reducing global emissions?
I think it's a red herring. And I don't see why that's dispositive on anything. It's larger than the damages from the carbon emissions that each household produces each month. It's about 2 times that.
So and that's assuming a cost of carbon of 40, 50 bucks.
So it seems like a great deal, right?
Except,
No, so I'm not trying to be argumentative.
I think it's a red herring to say, what will that do to global emissions? We make these decisions at the margin. At the margin, the U.S. people are willing to pay more than enough to cover their damages.
Okay, so the point I make about that is, great, let's do it. And what does that do to solve the problem? And you say, well, it's enough to...
we are the second highest emitter, the largest cumulative emitter.
Right, but sunk costs and sunk emissions are irrelevant to what's good policy going forward. That's a good moral argument. But if what you're trying to do is...
why should we do it?
No, I didn't ask why should we do it. I'm trying to... So I don't necessarily disagree that it would be... And I don't disagree that it would be a good thing to find a mechanism to put a price on carbon, a cost on carbon. But I just don't think that that's the holy grail to have, and I think we need to acknowledge that.
No, but I mean, so what was the acknowledgement then? The acknowledgement is, yes, it's the U.S., if you take the poll results literally, it seems to be willing to pay enough to average households, not all households. That's probably not true in India. But I think your point is a very important one, which is there has to be some technological breakthroughs that are going to make the economics look less challenging in other parts of the world. And, you know, honestly, everyone loves RPE. It's hard to be like a happy, smiling scientist in front of their bench. But RPE is like $300 million a year. It's nothing. There's no plausible rate of return that has a meaningful impact on...
good point.
Yeah, it's chunk change. So, but what we do know is that private markets respond, and so having $50 price per ton, not on the whole world, but in the second biggest economy, or second biggest carbon emitter, I think you would get an innovative response.
And I think the first biggest emitter is effectively moving in the same direction. China is right now.
You know,
they absolutely are.
They don't really have a market economy in the sense that
all right. And willingness to pay is whether your party will be willing to have you pay. But they're getting there.
Question over here? Okay.
So I had a question about where we have maybe seen progress, which relates to the renewable portfolio standards. So in a sense, certain states have decided we're going to require utilities to invest in renewable electricity, right, which decreases the carbon emissions. And it's essentially a political decision. I'm sure it is far from being, I'm sure Michael will tell me it's far from even being a second best solution to a tax. But I guess are there lessons learned from that might actually suggest a path forward? So one would be, hey, some states are willing to lead. Part of leading is that it increases the market for these kinds of investments. Whenever you increase market for an investment, then you're going to have greater production, which is going to get manufacturing gains, and so you can get some of the benefits from that. So I guess my question, and maybe Sue and and your colleagues at the analysis group kind of can say whether that's been meaningful or if it's all driven by gas. But I guess are there lessons learned from where at least some states have acted that suggest some people are willing to pay, and here's how we can get them to pay, and maybe that'll help drag along everybody else, and they'll get the benefits even if they aren't willing to pay quite as much?
I think that there's clear evidence that those policies are driving the introduction. The introduction of renewables into markets. They are accompanied by other policies, including tax credits, but those policies in the states are, I think, not only producing more megawatt hours from renewable technologies, but it's also really popular. People really like it. And it's not, I think, because of carbon. I think it's because of local jobs. And unfortunately, if it were about carbon, we would have technology neutral, zero emission markets and move things in. So to your point, yes, I think that there is, and that's the kind of regulation that I was referring to a little while ago, which is part of a portfolio of things, because those are really popular, you can get them done, and in fact, they're being effective and helping to drive down the cost. You may have a different.
Hello.
I just have seen the data that it's a very expensive way to get carbon reductions, and so I don't. It is interesting. I mean, the politics are interesting. You see RPSs in a majority of states. I don't know, but it's well over 30.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
it's 2/3.
Yeah,
2/3 of the states. Yeah.
And yet, there must be some other reason behind it besides
jobs. You notice that you usually have to have the eligible technologies are the ones that you can have in your state.
Right.
And yeah.
So I mean, it just is an interesting question. The governments are certainly capable of coming up with ineffective policies that seem to be. Why can't governments actually design cost-effective policies that will make a difference? And that, I mean, that's a very interesting political science question. I mean, I just remember when I was at EPA, one of the very first briefings I had was from a guy named Paul Stoltman. You may remember Paul.
Yep.
He's a very fine economist who had actually been involved in designing the lead phase down. And we had this briefing, and he said, if you want people to build, you know, windmills and solar panels, RPSs are a good idea. But if you want them to reduce CO2 emissions, it's a terrible idea.
Yes, that's why I would go for a technology neutral.
But you said you wanted to keep those as well as, you wanted to keep those regulations. See, I think that's another.
I meant that type of market pull. Because I don't think prices.
But a cost of carbon isn't enough to do that.
I don't think you could possibly get it high enough politically to get some of those barriers.
I mean, that may be right too.
Hello. Hi. My question is about, you talked about extreme weather events. My question was, is there a way to build in funding to deal with these reactive extreme weather events? Is there a way to build in funding for R&D that you were talking about with the, oh my goodness, there's a hurricane, we are responding, we have to be reactive. Is there a way to include in that money for responding to natural disasters? Is there a way to also include in that a mechanism to fund R&D research so that within the reactivity, there's a proactive solution coming out of it?
I think that is a very cool concept, but I think that the way that people make decisions about urgently getting a package of funding to help people on the ground usually doesn't have those kinds of important strings, logical strings attached to it. It's hard enough to get the replacement infrastructure built in a way that's really jumping and advancing the ball, because people just want to get it out there. I actually think that that would be an important element of moving technology, is if you actually modernized the grid while you were replacing it. But people just want to get some help fast.
Understandably.
Yeah, understandably, absolutely understandably.
Question here? I'll stay here and then we'll go to this side.
Just a question. We are very focused on what's the government going to do. And just an observation is that probably the two technologies that have had the most impact on the reduction of carbon emissions haven't had any support from the federal government.
Fracking did.
Well, to some extent. But
yeah, in the beginning. In the beginning.
But actually, it was a crazy
George Mitchell.
It was a crazy Texan, right? But also the increase in efficiency of combined cycle gas turbines.
Yes.
Those two things together.
That was the Defense Department.
Well, part of it was, but not all of it was.
Agreed.
A lot of it has to do with the digitization of that, and now you're talking about the digital oil field, so that's the next wave. So I guess the question is, how good is the government at figuring out which technologies, and is that a useful focus for us to say, oh, really, the government needs to be focusing on this technology or that technology or whatever? Or is there another way of thinking about how it is to try to capture some things that are already in play?
It's a complicated question. It's a great question. In both of the examples that you used, the role that the government played was in early stage systems. The contribution that the government played to fracking was a lot of high-powered computing looking at geological systems that really opened visibility into things underground. So George Mitchell was brilliant and innovated and took things beyond that.
3D seismic stuff.
3D seismic stuff, exactly. So that capability that I'm describing is not necessarily technology specific. It channels information and learning into different kinds of approaches. The government isn't usually very good at picking technology winners. The interesting thing about the little tiny engine that could of ARPA-E is that they are trying to use models that are copying the private sector innovation cycles as a vehicle for popping at a lot of different technologies. I'll stop there.
The only observation I would make is the private sector is very good at identifying ways to make money from technologies that the government has, right? I mean, we've seen that with GPSs, and we've seen it with, but I do think there's, and we can argue, I mean, I would agree that the budget for ARPA-E is ridiculously small, and that we ought to be spending more on it. But I think there is a role for government to do just basic R&D, and 95% of what they do may be dead ends. But all you need to do is have someone who picks up one of those technologies and recognizes that there's. But I don't think the private sector is really set up to do that kind of basic R&D research.
Here's an interesting. This is my little pet issue at the moment in terms of R&D for this complicated electric system that's evolving in the United States. There are systems integration issues that no company is going to invest in. The understanding about how different systems of control are communicating with grids that are both including local microgrids and solar panels, and then communicating out with a distant wind farm. That is a systems problem that is too big for any, and there's no way to capture the economic values in a way that makes it an attractive thing for somebody to do besides the government. So there are really important things that need to happen to enable these kinds of approaches, and I don't see who does it besides the government. They do a piece of it.
They have both weather forecasting for wind turbines and system integration.
Absolutely they do. They do.
They're one of the few companies that allows us to actually integrate what we have now. So it's not all government.
I did not mean to say that. I totally agree that Schneider is a great example of somebody who's taking pieces of this puzzle. And I'm sorry, I just can't see you. And so you're right to point that one out. That's great.
Another question? Oh, questions over here? Yes.
So going back to the Paris Agreement and the announcement by the Trump administration back in June to withdraw from it, following this announcement, some states, California, Washington, New York, created the Climate Alliance. So first part is thoughts on the Climate Alliance, whether or not you think more states should be joining it and whether or not states should be more proactive. And second part, Trump has stated that he is willing to re-enter the Paris Agreement under better conditions for American, particularly in the workers, and what exactly would those conditions look like?
Thanks for asking the regional. That was on my list of questions. I appreciate that.
So I think it's great that states are stepping up and trying to be allies in trying to attack the climate problem, the mitigation problem. Their policies are so varied across them. I mean, California's approaches couldn't be more different than Washington State's and so forth. So harmonizing some of those markets, maybe as a shadow way to get to a common US market, is not really likely yet. And I could go wax on and on about the politics of these issues in California are being so different than many of those other states. So I think it's great. I think that is where the action is driving. When I think it's pretty well known that when at the Clean Energy Ministerial in China, in Beijing, maybe it was in the summer, Secretary Perry went to this, and everybody from the other countries were hanging out with Governor Jerry Brown. It was bad optics for the United States. So I think it's really important. I guess I'll stop there.
Well, I'll try to answer the Paris question. It is very interesting that there certainly are, I think, officials at the State Department and elsewhere who are asking the very question you ask, because as was widely reported, there was a pretty big division within the administration, and you had senior level political officials who thought we ought to stay in Paris. The fact that the president has said he would be willing to have another deal that's a better deal for the United States, I think it's kind of hard. It's hard to see exactly what that would be, unless, and we could talk about Paris a lot, but the political symbolism of Paris is important to a lot of people, and if there were a way for the president to be able to show that there was an acknowledgement for the importance of preserving coal and giving credit for carbon capture and sequestration. I mean, there are things that could be explicitly acknowledged that might be politically important to him. The thing that's been a little bit difficult for a lot of us is because there was nothing binding about, the only things that are really binding in the Paris Agreement were already binding under the United States, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed back in 2000, in terms of annual inventories and reporting. The rest of it is all very much voluntary as countries kind of put their pledges on the table. And so one of the things that people pointed out is the United States could very easily simply withdraw the 26 to 28% pledge and say, we don't think that's realistic, so even at business as usual, we're going to get to 20% or whatever that would be. But I do think it's much more about the politics than it is about the substance of an agreement, because I think there needs to be a way for the administration to be able to say, look, we got a better deal for America's workers and coal miners.
But that's not going to bring back coal miners. I'm sorry. It's not, because the markets are driving coal out.
Markets are amazing.
It is true.
No, and it's, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the last coal stories I did, I was looking at coal employment. It's tiny.
It's teeny.
Amazon hires that many people in a month. It's
teeny.
It is tiny. This is old data, but it's something like 80. There were something like 80,000, under 80,000.
And it's been going down for 35 years.
Well, longer than that. The peak was pre-mechanization. Right. Mechanization technology is what killed
productivity improvement.
Is what killed coal jobs. There were something like there were more than 1 million coal jobs, and the big losses were mechanization after the Second World War. It was not.
Yes.
Yeah. Questions? Any others? Right here.
Just one
okay.
More.
One more question. This is it.
Drum roll.
So the VW scandal and the settlement coming out of that is going to lead to investment in the electric car. And I guess what's your question about policy being made through a settlement with an industrial company as opposed to through real regulation?
Oh, I'm going to kick this one to Jeff.
Policies get made in a lot of suboptimal ways.
All right, so I've asked our experts to talk a lot about the disconnect between what people want and what policymakers want or think that should be done, and businesses. Can maybe just thoughts from each of you, final thoughts from each of you, where there's some agreement, where there's some overlap, where we can make some progress, if any, while we're waiting for some of these policies to play out.
Wow. I think, I'm going to go back to the theme I've just said a minute ago. I think that there is profound agreement about the importance of a resilient electric grid. How we get there is lots of discussions on what that means.
And so you like these resiliency payments that they're talking about in there?
That's what I mean. I don't want, that's not what resiliency is about.
Jeff, how about you? You're the most hopeful, as you said, you're the most hopeful of all of us.
Notwithstanding the conversation, I still remain hopeful. And look, nobody knows the answers, but I really do believe there is a role for leadership here, and you don't often know where it's going to come from, and I hate to keep harping back on the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, but it's the only recent demonstration we have. And again, it wasn't that you had 50% of the people who were unwilling to pay even $1 more for clean air, or that you had, but you had someone who was willing to do the hard work to put together legislation. And I do think we need legislation, and it's my hope is that legislation actually does put a cost on carbon and replace a lot of these other much less effective things that we're doing today. I mean, we're spending an awful lot of money that we don't need to spend to get the results that we're getting. And so I would hope that policy would put a price on carbon, and also separately look at a way to fund basic R&D that could actually solve the problem on a global basis. Because a cost on carbon in the United States, and I agree we ought to look at everything on a marginal basis, but you also like to look at the bigger picture and say what could actually resolve this problem. But I don't think we're as far away as people think we are. The politics have changed a lot in the last 20 years, obviously, but I don't think that they're necessarily locked in. So I'm not nearly as pessimistic as others seem to be about this. So
can I just add one thing, because it occurs to me that one of the things that will help leadership is the kind of information that AP and EPIC put together. So this is really helpful, I think, in conditioning information out there about the fact that the public is ahead of policy. Well, thanks for letting me, thanks for having us. Thanks for letting me be a pushy journalist. That's what I like to do. I appreciate you answering all the questions, and thanks for doing this. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.